Morning glory, evening grace, brethren and sisters. Let's have all of it back along with us here with our Temperance Awakening, and we look forward to what we have here today. Going to be looking at smoking and society, so thank you for being with us. We wanted to also get into the history of smoking, but smoking and society, though, is such a long lecture, so much that we have here, that this is all that we'll be able to get into today. And then next week we'll do the history of smoking and probably only talk about the history of smoking, because that is a lecture that also has a lot of information. And so we'll get right into things here. And in American society, since colonial times, tobacco has played an important role. In Virginia and other southern colonies, tobacco was the main cash crop. And a fun trivia question there: who was it that really made it the main cash crop? It's a pretty popular person in pop culture. His wife was actually very popular. That's actually John Rolfe, who was the husband of Pocahontas, the popular Native American. Then in the early years of the United States, many men and some women smoked tobacco in pipes and cigars. Then in the 1880s, cigarettes began to be mass-produced whenever there was a gentleman. I think I was actually a pretty young man. He actually created a machine that was able to mass-produce cigarettes, much quicker than even what people in factories and stuff were able to do. And cigarettes became a big consumer item, although they still weren't extremely popular, because it was in the first half of the 20th century, cigarette sales rose steeply and the cigarette became entrenched in the social life of the United States. There, like around the 1920s, 30s or so forth, cigarettes started tasting a lot better. But then in 1964, Surgeon General Luther Terry, the government's highest health official, issued the first report linking smoking with cancer and other diseases. And at the time this report came out, cigarette ads ran on television every day, and every office had an ashtray. So, very different than our time now in 2021. You could smoke just about anywhere. Smoking was, very much a part of, everybody's everyday life, even for people who didn't smoke, because they were always around it. And smokers seemed to be a majority, as numerous as the cigarettes that march endlessly in ads across the nation's TV screens. American female smokers at that time, though, were a minority. Almost 52% of men smoked, but only about 34% of women smoked. And as more information on the dangers of smoking continued to come out, in 2001, only less than 25% of the U.S. population smoked. And then California really set the standard for the anti-smoking trends. And the first city in the U.S. to restrict smoking in some public places was Berkeley, California, back in 1977. And California voters considered several statewide attempts to establish smoking limitations in following years, but these referendums did fail to pass. In 1980, San Luis Obispo became the first city in the world to ban smoking in all public buildings, including bars and restaurants. And the University of California, San Francisco struck a major blow against the tobacco companies in 1994 when an unknown individual leaked thousands of pages of secret documents from Brown and Williamson, a major tobacco corporation, to a professor at the school. And like in the book that I wrote about tobacco, I talk about that a bit extensively. And through the university's library, these cigarette papers were open to the public. And when Brown and Williamson sued to prevent this, the California Supreme Court rejected the claim. The papers contained all sorts of damaging information that was made available on the internet, not just to Brown and Williamson, but even things about other tobacco companies as well. And in 1998, California became the first state to ban smoking in bars, continuing the battle on secondhand smoke. And in 1988, California come up with a 5-point program for tobacco control. And these 5 points were: number 1, increase the prices of tobacco products through higher taxes. Number 2, use community-based programs to educate the public on the dangers of smoking. Thirdly, establish smoke-free workplaces and public spaces. Fourth, support programs to help people quit smoking. And lastly, run counter-advertising campaigns to remove the appeal of smoking. And after 11 years of these policies, 1988 through 1994, California enjoyed the second lowest ranking smoking rate in the country, as well as steep reductions in cancer rates. The state with the lowest smoking population was Utah, namely due to its large Mormon population, because the Church of Latter-day Saints is very, very much against tobacco use. A study by researchers at the University of California, San Diego showed that when the state reduced the budget for anti-smoking programs in 1993, youth smoking rose slightly from 9 to 11%. Then in 2002, as a result of state budget troubles, California imposed severe cuts on funding for its tobacco control programs. However, youth smoking actually declined despite the cut in these programs, due to a survey in 2003. And now looking at the social impact for adults. Since the Surgeon General's report in 1964, attitudes about smoking and smokers have changed in small and large ways. In the 70s, non-smokers formed groups to protect their rights and raise questions about the health dangers of secondhand smoke, which is the tobacco smoke left in the air by burning cigarettes and breathed in by everyone nearby, which is what we talked about last class. And by the 80s, as more localities began establishing smoking restrictions, smokers found fewer places to indulge in their habit. In 1990, Congress banned smoking on all U.S. domestic flights. By 1999, smoking was also banned on international flights. That year of 99, 79% of workplaces with at least 50 or more employees banned smoking or limited to special areas. Restaurants advertised smoke-free areas, and in some communities, local governments voted to keep all public places smoke-free. Secondhand smoke was no longer only a problem just for non-smokers, now it was a problem for the people who smoked. In the 1960s, the phrase, "mind if I smoke," wasn't really that much of a courtesy, just more so an announcement as in I'm going to smoke. But by the end of the 20th century, though, in the late 90s, more and more non-smokers did mine. A draft report for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency noted that 46% of respondents to an opinion poll expressed annoyance with secondhand smoke in 1964, and then by 1987, that went all the way up to 69%. And among the many secret tobacco documents made public by leaks or through court cases was a 1982 survey of smokers commissioned by R.J. Reynolds, which is also another very big cigarette manufacturer, the second biggest behind Philip Morris. According to the survey, 60% of the respondents faced restrictions on smoking at work. The most surprising answer on the survey, however, dealt with smoking restrictions in public places like restaurants and bars. An overwhelming majority, 79% of smokers who had to live with these restrictions, approved of them. What a surprise. The report explained the discrepancy by saying that smokers were becoming increasingly unsure about how welcome their habit would be. Restrictions, in a way, became reassuring. There were still places that could be considered safe territory. And today, though, just about all these places of safe territory have disappeared. Just about in all of, North America. And now looking at the social impact for teenagers. Attitudes about teen smoking have also changed in the last 40 years. What was once considered a minor vice has become a major problem. Since the 1980s, tobacco companies have been criticized for aiming advertising at young people, even grade school students, people that are really too young to smoke. Efforts to reduce the number of young smokers have met with varying results. The 1990s saw an upswing in smoking among youth, due in part, many believe, to a couple of campaigns like the Joe Camel ad campaign, as well as the Marlboro Man. The Marlboro Man, was like a tough, looking guy, like all tough, handsome guy smoke. While Joe Camel was, like a cartoon character, a cartoon camel with an edgy image. And Joe made smoking look glamorous to a lot of young people. But then, though, in the early 2000s, though, youth smoking dropped a lot, except for a surprising new development. In the early 2000s, which I remember when I was in high school, in 2002, a national survey on drug use and health showed that cigarette use in the youngest age group, 12 to 17 years, actually showed more female than male smokers, and that was certainly a first. And so now people still in 2021... they're curious what tobacco is going to do, along with vaping, since vaping and all is very big now, as well as the rise also of smoking pipes, smoking cigars. And although for teen smokers today, though, the reality is actually very different from what was shown by images in the media of some years ago. Most of the people now who smoke are actually high school dropouts. 56% according to a 1999 drug abuse survey, which is still very accurate here even in 2021, and also among unemployed young people. And even for those who stay in school, smoking, as we've gone in before, can lead to riskier activities. Polls and things have shown that young people who smoke are much more prone to drink alcohol and to use drugs. And most like teenagers that you find who use tobacco now or vape are, like we said, are like people of lower income communities, like kids who drop out of school, etc. And now looking at some societal cost of smoking. As social attitudes towards smoking has changed, many smokers became aware of the personal costs associated with their habit. Depending on the severity of their health problems, some lost their teeth, their ability to work, or even their lives. Seeing that tobacco use is the leading preventable cause of death in the U.S. and the world. Beyond the personal losses or other costs connected to smoking, could consumers trust the safety of the products that they buy? Should state governments demand additional payment from companies that make illegal products and pay heavy taxes on them? Should employers and insurance companies discriminate against people because of their lifestyle choices? And now we'll look at some lawsuits that happen. We kind of mentioned these before in other lectures, but now getting into this in a bit more detail about some lawsuits toward tobacco companies. And one of the first really popular articles which led people to show the connection between smoking and cancer was in 1952 by Reader's Digest, when they published an article titled "Cancer by the Carton." And now, within 2 years, within 2 years of that article of 1952, cancer patients began suing tobacco companies to recover the cost of their medical care. Lawyers argue that cigarette companies failed to warn customers about the cancer dangers in their product, therefore they should be held liable for damages. And for decades, tobacco companies won these cases, just because tobacco companies were so wealthy, they had the best lawyers you could buy, whereas most people trying to sue them, were at best like middle-class people who couldn't afford, the type of case and investigation things to win their cases. In 1994, the most serious attempt to sue tobacco companies took shape as 60 law firms from across the country joined forces to file a class action in federal court. A class action lawsuit covers all those who have been harmed by an action. The lawsuit demanded that the tobacco companies pay damages, not actually for getting people, not for causing people to get diseases and to have cancer and heart disease, strokes, etc. But it was actually they were suing tobacco companies because they said tobacco companies were lying to people about the addictive power of nicotine. And so in 1996, a federal appeals court struck down the case, though. Judges found that the circumstances of the 90 million individuals involved were just too different, and that the state laws involved in the case were also too dissimilar. The judges also commented on the unprecedented size of the case and the threat that it presented. One single jury, deciding the fate of millions of people and a major industry was just too much. And so the law firms then launched class action suits in all 50 states. Although many of these cases were also thrown out of court, in 2002 a Florida jury awarded the smokers $145 million in punitive damages, the largest amount ever awarded in a civil lawsuit, although this decision was later reversed on appeal. The cigarette companies had averted that major threat, but they faced an even more serious challenge in 1995, when Michael Moore, Mississippi's Attorney General, filed a lawsuit against the tobacco companies to recover the money that the state spent treating people for tobacco-related illnesses. And he began a trend that ended with similar suits in all 50 states. 4 states, Texas, Florida, Mississippi, and Minnesota, settled separately. And after years of negotiations, the remaining states' lawsuits were also settled out of court, under the terms of what became known as the Master Settlement Agreement, which was extremely popular, very, very well-known case. That was signed in 1998, and the tobacco companies agreed to pay the states $205 billion over 25 years. The agreement also set aside $1.7 billion to create the American Legacy Foundation, an organization to educate the public and help protect young people from tobacco products. As part of the agreement, tobacco companies also agreed to dissolve several organizations they had funded to promote smoking and counteract criticism of the industry. The companies also agreed to stop advertising to young people, and on billboards, many corporate papers, which had been secret, were now open to the public. Some anti-tobacco activists complained that this master settlement agreement, though, didn't go far enough. It didn't punish the cigarette manufacturers. They were allowed to go on with their business and pass the heavy cost of the settlement on to the shoulders of cigarette smokers through higher prices. However, though, thanks to the settlement, the American Legacy Foundation was able to launch its Truth campaign. If you remember that, I remember that very well because I was, a young person, a teenager when that was really going on. And Truth was the first major nationwide advertising campaign against tobacco in 30 years. And price hikes on tobacco also contributed to a downturn in tobacco use. And now the cost of health coverage, which we slightly mentioned there, which was a lot of money. And when PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service program on the crisis in healthcare, aired in 2000, a number of experts offered background information, including Dr. Thomas Murray, president of the Hastings Center, a group that studies the ethics of healthcare. He explained the beginnings of large-scale health coverage in the U.S. In the 40s, during the Second World War, wage and price controls were placed on American employers, and in order to compete for employees, they could offer health benefits. In those days, it was cheap. In recent decades, though, healthcare costs have risen, and so has the cost of insurance. Companies have begun asking employees to pay for some of this cost. This has led to a new controversy over smoking. Group health plans are a way to get coverage at a wholesale price by spreading the risk. Payments for single employees help bring down the cost of healthcare for workers with many children, help the young workers with little need for doctors, help to cover the cost for older employees. Forced to reach into their own pockets, though, employees have started looking at healthcare in a new light. Is it fair for everyone to pay for people who are more likely, to get diseases and things, especially if they bring it on themselves with lifestyle choices like, tobacco use or overeating or binge drinking? Should health coverage be like some life insurance policies where non-smokers get to pay less? A 2003 survey by the Wall Street Journal found that Americans have not made really firm decisions at that time on these questions. Less than half, 46%, felt that people who made unhealthy lifestyle choices should not be forced to pay more for insurance, and even fewer respondents, 37%, felt that people with unhealthy lifestyles should pay higher prices for insurance. However, when the question was posed specifically about smoking, 58% were in favor of smokers paying higher insurance premiums than non-smokers versus just 31% that were against it. And now looking at premature death and disability, which often happens with tobacco users. On average, male smokers live 13.2 years less than non-smokers. Female smokers live about 14.5 years less than non-female smokers. When you add up the number of people who die from smoking-related causes, that cost gets very high. According to a 2002 report from the CDC, productivity losses in the U.S. from smokers' deaths averaged almost $81.9 billion a year between 1995 and 1999. The report also stated that expenses for people with smoking-related illnesses came to nearly $57.5 billion from 1998, and that cost of care for newborn babies with health problems because of smoking came to $366 million in 1996. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the government agency which tracks healthcare programs, reported that Americans spent $1.6 trillion on healthcare in 2002. Private spending was $549.6 billion. Medicare, the federal healthcare benefits program for the elderly and permanently disabled, cost taxpayers $267 billion. Medicaid, a health insurance program for those with a low income that has its costs shared by federal and state governments, came in at $247 billion. According to a Columbia University study of 1995 health costs, 14% of Medicare spending went to treating tobacco-related diseases. Excuse me. The diseases also accounted for 6.6% of Medicaid costs in 1996. According to a study for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. If these percentages are applied to the 2002 numbers, they give some idea of the large sums of money involved. And now looking at, the cost of Medicare and Medicaid, which is your state dollars at work if you pay taxes, which everybody does in some sense, in the U.S. In 2002, the Organization for Tobacco-Free Kids, which is an anti-smoking action group, found that tobacco-related Medicaid costs for all 50 states totaled more than $10.11 billion. And the states also faced an additional $2.2 billion for smoking-related problems. States with a large population and generous Medicaid benefits faced steep expenses. California paid $1.15 billion, while New York spent more than $2 billion. The very small populated state of Wyoming paid the lowest amount of Medicaid costs at $11.2 million. Most states were in the $40 million to hundreds of millions of dollars range for the year. Although yearly payments from the master settlement agreement with the tobacco companies were supposed to cover these costs, cash-strapped states like New Jersey and Washington have often used that money to cover budget deficits. Some have even securitized their settlement monies, essentially taking out a loan on their promised payments for a one-time cash amount. To protect their settlement payments, state governments have even stepped into other tobacco lawsuits on the tobacco company side. Recently, when a judge imposed a $12 billion bond on the Philip Morris Company, 37 states joined the tobacco company to have the bond reduced. What was their reason for that? And that sounds kind of contrary to what they would be doing. It's because heavy judgments on tobacco companies might drive them into bankruptcy and stop the master settlement agreement payments, plain and simple. So thanks for being with us here today. As we said, we'll be looking at the history of smoking next week, and so we do look forward to that. And we'll see you then, till the day breaks and the shadows flee away. I am Dr. Cooper, and I love you, and I appreciate you.